Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, the Senate will take a vote shortly on a resolution from Senator Schmitt dealing with infrastructure funding. The discussion of the resolution has been pretty quiet because on its face, it looks like it's an issue dealing with a lot of budgetary lingo and Washington ease. Obligated funds and expenditure deadlines is what people hear about. But the reality is, this proposal is anti-infrastructure. It could put stop work orders on thousands of infrastructure projects across the country. Some of them have shovels in the ground as we speak. And my concern, Mr. President, we pass this and we'd be going virtually from a period where folks in Georgia and elsewhere had hard hats on to they're facing layoffs. Now here's the background. In 2021, the Congress passed emergency funding for state and local governments. At the time, there was a big concern that their budgets would get clobbered by the pandemic, which had hammered our economy and put millions out of work. But state and local budgets fared better than expected. So later on, senators were looking on a bipartisan basis for smart ways to rebuild our infrastructure, roads and bridges and highways, water and sewer, also broadband projects. And there was bipartisan agreement that Congress ought to allow that leftover state and local funding to be repurposed for these important infrastructure projects. So both sides of this chamber, the Republican side, the Democratic side, Mr. President, passed legislation multiple times, even by unanimous consent, that provided what the states and localities wanted, which was more flexibility. We hear our colleagues on the other side talk a lot about wanting to cut red tape, get the federal government out of the way, empower the states, laboratories of democracy. Here's a case where my colleagues on the other side got exactly what they wanted: more flexibility for the states to use taxpayer funds on infrastructure. Have a Wyden concern, a highway that needs widening, a bridge that's past its useful life, a water system with lead pipes that need replacing. Congress voted on a bipartisan basis to make that easier. It's a real head-scratcher why Republicans would now want to make this difficult. Now, some have accused the Treasury Department of playing around with the expiration of the program. That hasn't happened at all. It's the same program with the same timeline and the same rules that Democrats and Republicans agreed on as recently as a few short months ago. I mentioned at the outset that this resolution puts a stop work order on thousands of projects nationwide. The numbers just really stun you when you walk through them. On the Finance Committee, we asked the Treasury Department what the impact could be in specific states. Here's an example. In the Senate President's state of Georgia, 17 projects totaling $1.4 billion could be terminated. Michigan, 160 projects. Ohio, 342 projects. Arizona, 50 projects. Montana, 404 projects. West Virginia, 73 projects. Nationwide, Mr. President, there could be thousands of projects closed. Tens or even hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. Higher costs for families and businesses that had to wait far too long for Congress to get serious about infrastructure. So I'll just tell my colleagues, as we gear up for a vote, this one is one of the most unusual votes that I've seen recently, a true head-scratcher. Bipartisanship, we all know, is a heavy lift. But the progress we've made on this issue, in my view, is actually a bipartisan highlight of the last several years. I talk to my colleagues a lot about how we find some common ground. Here we have, from day one, Senator Cornyn, my colleague on the Finance Committee, and Senator Padilla working from the outset to add additional flexibility for the pool of funds that would be available. So a Republican United States Senator a Democratic United States senator put together a proposal that, get this, colleagues, passed by unanimous consent 3 times. So if the Senate was to walk back this bipartisan effort, originally led by a senator from California, a Democrat, a senator from Texas, a Republican, the bottom line would be that starting almost immediately, Mr. President, those hard hats that I mentioned in states like yours and others could be coming off, and they'd be looking at ways to keep a roof over their head and pay for food for their families and health care. So I'll close by this. I just don't see a good reason for the United States Senate to backtrack on solid bipartisan progress and have this chamber act in a way that leaves more of our nation's infrastructure in a state of disrepair. I urge my colleagues to preserve the bipartisan work that has been done on this issue that got strong votes 3 times. Preserve the work that's been done on this issue for infrastructure, oppose the resolution, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of my resolution that would overturn a rule from the Department of Treasury that affects the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Treasury's attempted sleight of hand to keep the COVID spending spigot on is an insult to Congress and those who believe that are in our Constitution, as well as a complete misuse of taxpayer dollars. As we vote today, we as a body must ask ourselves a couple of simple questions. First, are we going to allow funds meant for COVID recovery to be spent after the so-called quote-unquote emergency ended? Or are we finally able to install fiscal responsibility as our national debt spirals further out of control? And second, are we willing to defend the Article I branch from an overreaching agency and bureaucrats who want to claim more and more power for themselves? The spending in this program, which is hardly the point right now, actually, with this extension of the time, but it's worth noting, has been wasteful on many occasions. When Congress provided $350 billion for the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, I don't think one could imagine that the fund would have been used for golf courses and swimming pools and tennis courts, maybe to some. It also became a slush fund to incentivize illegal immigration. $340 million for cash payments to illegal immigrants in Washington State. $3.6 million in Illinois to help illegal immigrants apply for citizenship. $2 million in D.C. to help turn the District of Columbia into a quote-unquote proud sanctuary city. Regardless of whether you supported the spending or not, this fund had a specific purpose. This fund was designated to aid state governments and local governments with revenue shortfalls tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. When Congress created this fund, Congress provided a clear restriction. In statute, Congress required that all costs incurred with money from this fund must be incurred by December 31st, 2024. That is the statute, that's congressional language. In short, recipients had over 3 years to obligate this funding, or the funding would be returned to the federal treasury. Most states and localities understood the requirements. As of March of 2023, over a year ago, all states had obligated at least 60% of their funding, while localities had obligated over 54%. Yet, lo and behold, while most people in this body were celebrating Thanksgiving with our families, the Treasury Department tried to pull a fast one on the American people. The Treasury Department decided it knew better than this body and better than Congress. and the department rewrote the law to fit its own needs and special interests. Even though the statute said all costs must be incurred by the end of this calendar year, the Treasury Department decided that receipts could still use these COVID recovery dollars way past 2024. This is infuriating on a bunch of different levels. First, the administration ended the public health emergency for the pandemic on May 11th, 2023. Now, most Americans have moved on well beyond that, but even this administration acknowledged over a year ago that it was over. It's also crazy because even though this administration said COVID ended about a year ago, bureaucrats at the Treasury Department decided we should just keep spending money anyway, spending billions into 2025 and 2026 to recover from COVID. Just think about that for a second. But beyond this, beyond there being no rational reason to continue the spending for COVID recovery, this rule does not even keep the spigot on in order to directly benefit our constituents. This is bureaucrats giving a helping hand and a paycheck to, you guessed it, other bureaucrats. Earlier this week, Secretary Yellen attempted to assert that if this rule is overturned, and I heard this from my colleague, then infrastructure projects would grind to a halt. That is false. That is not true. This administration, once again, is using fear-mongering as a reckless tactics for a radical agenda. Let's be honest with the American people and look at the text of this rule. Under this new Treasury rule, the funding is limited to administrative and legal costs, such as compliance costs and internal control requirements. This rule ensures that funding does not go to bridges or broadband, but to bureaucrats. And this rule has real costs. This rule, if it continues, will cost taxpayers at least $13 billion, if not more. That boils down to about $1,200 for each and every American family. And around here, as I've learned, $13 billion doesn't seem like a lot of money to people, but we're $34 trillion in debt. We're spending nearly the same amount on interest payments on that debt as we do our national defense. This fiscal recklessness is unsustainable. The actions like this from the Treasury rule are a prime reason why we are $34 trillion in debt. Our constituents demand that we actually hold the line, that we stop spending beyond our means, especially when the rules encourage spending that is wasteful. I ask my colleagues to join me today in supporting this resolution. COVID is over. Our national debt is out of control. Inflation is sky high. It's time to reinstate fiscal responsibility here in the United States Senate. I yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. President. Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? You want to talk?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There appears to be. The yeas and nays are ordered. Senator from Oregon.
I'm going to be very brief, but I want senators to know that this is about standing up for schools that need to replace lead pipes. That's the kind of effort that Senator Cornyn, Senator Padilla, myself, and others said was essential for this country. My colleague from Missouri, and look forward to getting to know him more. He's new to the Senate. Sets this up that somehow this is unnecessary and basically just fueling more red tape. Quite the opposite. If colleagues go home this weekend during the recess, they will see people in their states having good paying jobs for a good day's work, repairing bridges, dealing with lead pipes. And that, colleague, why on 3 separate occasions the Senate Democrats and Republicans came together. And my colleague, I don't ever want to be critical of someone's attention, has made it out that this will just be getting rid of some red tape and bureaucracy. Well, I want senators who are going to vote in a little bit to understand that this is not about that. This is about what it's really like in our communities where so many people are still hurting. And what I have in my mirror is priorities like schools needing to replace, lead pipe. That's what we had in mind when we started this effort. Senator Cornyn on the other side, myself, Senator Padilla. I hope that the Senate won't vote here at 6 o'clock to essentially pull this effort up from the roots and throw it aside, because a lot of people will get hurt, and senators are going to hear about it pretty soon, because these are projects that are underway today. They're underway now. And Democrats and Republicans felt they'd make a difference for our communities, and we shouldn't tear up that effort in the name of this resolution that tries to suggest that this is mostly about cutting, red tape, which is not the case. It's about cutting jobs in our communities, and we're going to lose a lot of opportunities for some smart investments for the future, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Missouri.
Just to respond briefly, it may not have been his priority list, but it is worth pointing out that, again, some priorities of these dollars, like $340 million cash payments to illegal immigrants, have been spent from this fund. But be that as it may, if the concern from my colleague is that these projects for lead pipe replacement and schools, if they've been obligated, nothing is going to change with that. And I want to make that very clear. In fact, those obligations are still extended through 2024 as the statute called for. What this is all about is one simple fact. Do we think that Treasury can rewrite the law to extend these bureaucratic payments that, by the way, are part of the submissions that these state and locals have made for legal fees, other compliance costs? That's all in these submissions. This is to get overtime for 2 more years to spend approximately $13 billion. And again, that is $1,200 out of the budgets of American families across this country. And so we have an opportunity to restore some fiscal sanity, to stand up for the Article 1 branch. Whether you agree with that law or not, it said those obligations had to be incurred before the end of 2024. We're not changing that. We're just saying Treasury doesn't get to do an end run around Congress and, again, have $13 billion more go out the door to lawyers and to bureaucrats. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back and ask for the yeas and nays.